My name is Eliza Merritt. I'm 29 years old, and the first time my father called me unstable in public, he did it under fluorescent lights that hummed like they were bored with the whole thing. Hennepin County Family Court, Minneapolis, February. The kind of cold that makes your lungs feel like paper when you step outside and your eyelashes freeze before you reach the door. I remember thinking, as I stood there waiting for the clerk to call our case, that the courthouse smelled like burnt coffee and lemon disinfectant, like somebody had tried to scrub away something permanent. I didn't say a word. Let me take you there properly. My father, Thomas Merritt, 58 years old, retired fire captain, stood at the petitioner's table in a charcoal suit that pulled tight across his shoulders. He has always been a broad man, solid, built like someone who spent decades kicking down doors. His jaw was set so hard I could see the muscle ticking near his ear. When he gets angry, he doesn't shout right away. He compresses, like a coil. His attorney, Carla Jennings, silver hair cut sharp at the chin, glasses perched low on her nose, flipped through a yellow legal pad with the calm efficiency of someone who has done this 1,000 times. Behind them sat Denise, my stepmother, blonde, composed, hands folded in her lap like she was waiting for communion instead of custody proceedings. And me, Eliza Merritt, 29, licensed marriage and family therapist, mother of one 4-year-old boy who was at preschool at that very moment, probably arguing about whose turn it was with the blue truck. I was wearing a navy blazer I bought at Nordstrom Rack because one sleeve button had fallen off and they'd marked it down. I stitched it back on the night before while Noah slept, the thread slightly darker than the fabric if you looked closely enough. I kept my hands flat on the table. That was the trick I'd given clients for years. Ground yourself physically when the room starts to tilt. Feel the wood. Feel your breath. My father's voice filled the courtroom when it was his turn to speak. That same voice that once commanded firefighters through smoke. Controlled, projected, certain. He said I was unstable. He said I had a history of emotional volatility. He said he feared for my son's well-being. He said Noah would be safer in his home, where there was structure, consistency, discipline. The word landed heavier than the others. He talked about my divorce as if it were evidence. He mentioned therapy in a tone usually reserved for indictments. He referenced medication, like it was a confession. I kept my face still. If you've ever worked in mental health long enough, you learn how to listen to accusations without absorbing them. You let them pass through you like weather. That's what I told myself I was doing. But there is something different about hearing your own father build a case against you. The courtroom wasn't large, a few rows of wooden benches, a state seal mounted behind the judge's bench. The court reporter's fingers moved lightly over her machine, capturing every word. I could hear the faint scratch of pen on paper as Carla made notes. Judge Annika Soderberg presided from above us, robe crisp, expression unreadable. She wore her glasses on a thin silver chain and had the kind of presence that made theatrics feel embarrassing. She didn't interrupt my father. She let him speak. He described me as fragile. That word again. Fragile, as if I were porcelain. As if I hadn't held my son through stomach flu at 3 a.m., hadn't rebuilt a life after betrayal, hadn't paid a mortgage and student loans and daycare bills on one income. Fragile. He cited a late-night phone call to my sister after my ex-husband canceled parenting time. He cited 6 months on sertraline, prescribed by my doctor. He cited weekly therapy appointments during my divorce. He did not cite the 5 years I've spent helping couples salvage marriages or navigate co-parenting without destroying each other. He did not cite the licensing board that oversees my work. He did not cite the dozens of families who trust me with their hardest truths. He framed responsible choices as red flags. I sat there and let him. I didn't look at him while he spoke. I looked at the judge, or sometimes at the wood grain on the table, or at my own stitched button. I could feel Denise watching me, not with anger, with appraisal, like she was measuring whether this was working. My father finished by saying, "I'm just concerned about my grandson. I believe he needs stability." Concern, stability, the language of care, sharpened into something else. Judge Soderberg looked down at the file in front of her. She turned a page slowly, then another. The room went quiet in that particular way courtrooms do, where even breathing feels amplified. She looked up at my father. and she asked a question so simple it split the air in half. But before I tell you what she said, you need to understand how we got there. Because courtrooms don't appear out of thin air. They are built slowly, out of grief, money, pride, inheritance, and the old stories families tell about who is strong and who is not. And ours started long before that February morning. If you want to understand how my father ended up standing in a courtroom calling me unstable, you have to understand my grandmother, Ruth Kaplan. Because none of this began with custody paperwork. It began in her kitchen on 42nd Street, under cabinets painted a soft butter yellow sometime in 1987 and never updated, because, as she liked to say, if it still works, why argue with it? Ruth was 76 when she died. 5 feet tall, stubborn as frozen ground in January, and softer than anyone who didn't know her well would ever guess. She wore cardigans year-round and had a collection of ceramic mugs from every state park she'd ever visited. She baked rye bread every Sunday morning, whether someone was coming over or not. The house should smell like something, she'd say. Otherwise, it feels abandoned. She called me every Wednesday at 7:30 p.m. Not long calls. 10, 15 minutes. Did Noah finally give up naps? Was I eating something besides cereal? Had the snow started sticking to the sidewalks yet? She never asked probing questions. She just stayed on the line long enough for me to feel less alone. When my marriage unraveled the winter before she died, it happened quickly. Not loudly. No shattered plates or screaming matches. Just quiet betrayal and long silences that stretched like cracks in ice. One night, I found myself sitting on the edge of my bed at 1:47 a.m., staring at my phone, realizing I didn't recognize the life I was living. 3 days later, I packed a duffel bag, loaded Noah into his car seat, and drove to Ruth's house without calling. I had never done that before. I remember sitting in her driveway with the engine running, watching the exhaust curl into the cold air, trying to decide whether I could go through with knocking on the door. I looked at Noah in the rearview mirror, his cheeks pink from the wind, clutching his stuffed raccoon. Then the front door opened. Ruth stood there in wool socks and a green cardigan, like she'd sensed me through the walls. "You look cold," she said. "Come in." That was it. No interrogation, no lecture, no strategic plan for my future. Just soup already simmering on the stove and the spare bedroom made up with flannel sheets. She took Noah from my arms and said, "Let's show you where the good blankets are." I stayed 8 days. 8 days of waking up to the sound of radiators hissing and Ruth humming off-key in the kitchen. 8 days of Noah building towers out of her old wooden blocks while I slept past 7 for the first time in months. 8 days of not having to pretend I was fine. On the second night, her phone rang while I was sitting at the kitchen table staring into a mug of chamomile tea. She glanced at the caller ID and pressed her lips together before answering. I didn't need to hear the voice on the other end to know it was my father. The tension in her shoulders told me everything. "Yes, Tom?" she said calmly. I could hear his voice faintly through the receiver, sharp, controlled, edged with something impatient. Ruth didn't interrupt him. She listened. After about 30 seconds, she said, "She's safe here. That's what matters." There was a pause. "No," she added. "I won't be doing that." She hung up, set the phone down, and went back to stirring the soup like nothing had happened. I didn't ask what he said. I didn't have the energy. I didn't find out until months later, after her funeral, when my sister Carly told me through tears what Dad had repeated at Sunday dinner like it was a funny anecdote. "Stop coddling her," he told Ruth. "She's always been fragile. If you keep rescuing her, she'll never stand on her own." Fragile. That word threaded through my childhood in ways I hadn't fully understood until then. I was the quiet one, the sensitive one, the one who read books at family gatherings instead of arguing about football. When I cried as a kid, my father would sigh and say, "You've got to toughen up, Liz. The world doesn't bend." Ruth never once used that word about me. In her house, I wasn't fragile. I was tired. I was hurting. I was rebuilding. On the 4th day of my stay, she sat across from me at the kitchen table while Noah colored on scrap paper and said, "You know, strength doesn't always look loud." I didn't realize until much later that she was answering something I hadn't said out loud. When I told her I'd started therapy and that my doctor had prescribed a low dose of sertraline, she nodded like I'd told her I'd joined a gym. "Good," she said. use the tools. That was Ruth. Practical compassion, no drama. When I left after those 8 days, she packed rye bread in a paper bag and pressed it into my hands. "This isn't permanent," she said gently, "but neither is this part." She died 9 months later. Heart attack while raking leaves in her front yard. The neighbor found her and called 911. By the time I got there, the paramedics were already closing the ambulance doors. I remember standing on her sidewalk, watching yellow tape flutter in the wind, and feeling something shift under my feet. Not just grief, something else. I didn't know then that her house would become the center of a battle. I didn't know that the same man who told her to stop rescuing me would soon accuse me of manipulation. I didn't know that the word fragile would reappear in a courtroom. All I knew was that for 8 days, in a kitchen that smelled like soup and rye bread, I had been safe. And that mattered. 3 weeks after we buried Ruth, we sat in an attorney's office near Lake Street with beige walls, brown carpet worn thin along the edges, and a ficus tree that looked like it had survived 3 recessions out of sheer stubbornness. I remember the hum of the overhead lights and the way the radiator clanked every few minutes like it was trying to participate in the conversation. My father sat to my left, Denise beside him, legs crossed neatly, hands folded in her lap, Carly across from me, eyes red from crying, twisting a tissue into a thin rope between her fingers. I could still smell the faint trace of Ruth's perfume on the wool coat hanging over the back of my chair. The attorney cleared his throat and began reading the will. It wasn't long. Ruth had never been dramatic. The house on 42nd Street to Eliza Merritt, $20,000 to Carly Merritt, personal belongings to be divided evenly between my son and grandchildren. There was a pause after he finished. Not a long one, maybe 5 seconds, but it felt like a shift in air pressure, like before a storm breaks. I looked at my father. His expression hadn't changed, not visibly, but his eyes had gone flat in a way I recognized. It wasn't grief. It wasn't even surprise. It was calculation. "There must be a mistake," he said evenly. "My mother would never bypass her own son." The attorney adjusted his glasses and explained that the will had been updated 2 years earlier. Witnessed. Notarized. No ambiguity in the language. Ruth had been evaluated by her physician that same year for an unrelated matter and found fully competent, clear, clean, legal. Denise's hand tightened around the strap of her purse. Carly stared at the table. I sat very still because something inside me understood before the words were spoken that this wasn't over. 6 days later, I was in the staff lounge at the clinic when the receptionist came in holding a large envelope and said, "Eliza, you've been served." I laughed at first. Not because it was funny, because my brain refused to catch up. I was holding a yogurt in one hand and legal documents in the other, scanning words like undue influence, vulnerable adult, coercion. My father was contesting the will. He was alleging that I had manipulated Ruth during a period of emotional fragility, that I had isolated her from family, that I had persuaded her to alter her estate plan in my favor. I stood there in my work badge and sensible flats, reading an accusation that painted me as a calculating predator. Here's the detail that still makes my jaw tighten when I think about it. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. I spend my days helping families untangle conflict. I teach parents how not to triangulate their children into adult disputes. I document carefully. I follow ethics codes. I have a state board that audits my continuing education hours. And somehow, according to my father, I had masterminded a campaign of elder exploitation between couples' counseling sessions. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been my life. The petition described my 8-day stay at Ruth's house during my divorce as increased presence and influence. It referenced my professional knowledge of psychological vulnerabilities as if my degree were a weapon. I brought the paperwork home and sat at Ruth's kitchen table, staring at the words while Noah colored dinosaurs on the floor. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been when she was alive. No humming, no kettle whistling, just the low hiss of the radiators and the faint scratch of crayon on paper. I hired an estate attorney the next morning. He was younger than I expected, confident, direct. He read the petition twice, then looked up at me and said, "This is thin, thin." That word steadied me. We gathered medical records confirming Ruth's cognitive health, statements from neighbors who saw her walking to the grocery store alone, documentation of the will signing with witnesses present. The hearing was brief, clinical. My father's attorney attempted to imply that my professional background gave me undue persuasive power. The judge asked for evidence of diminished capacity. There wasn't any. Case dismissed. I remember stepping outside the courthouse into early spring air that still carried winter's edge. I stood on the sidewalk and let myself believe, for a moment, that it was finished. That grief had just collided with pride, and we had survived the impact. I moved into Ruth's house 2 months later. Noah picked the bedroom that faced the backyard. I painted the living room a soft gray because the old wallpaper made the space feel smaller than it was. I kept Ruth's dining table and her mismatched chairs. I left her ceramic mugs in the cabinet exactly where they'd always been. It felt like building something steady. My father didn't call. Denise didn't text. Carly came over once with takeout and cried in the hallway because she hated being in the middle. For 3 weeks, the world was quiet. I unpacked boxes, I set up Noah's bookshelf. I paid the first mortgage payment in my own name, and then the next envelope arrived. This one thicker, this one heavier, this one with the words third-party custody petition printed across the top. The will contest had been about money. This was about my son. And in that moment, standing again in the kitchen where Ruth once stirred soup and told me strength didn't have to be loud, I understood something with absolute clarity. This had never been about the house alone. It was about control. And my father was not done. The second time I was served, I was heating up leftover pasta in the clinic break room, staring at my phone and trying to remember whether I'd signed Noah's permission slip for pajama day. The receptionist walked in with that same careful expression and said, "Eliza, there's someone here for you." I didn't laugh this time. The envelope was thicker, heavier. The words at the top felt like a punch I didn't see coming. Petition for third-party custody. I stood there with the microwave humming behind me and read that my father believed I was emotionally unfit to parent my own son. He cited instability following my divorce. He cited my history of psychiatric medication. He cited erratic behavior. He cited concern for Noah's safety. I read it once, then twice. The language was formal, almost clinical, but underneath it I could hear my father's voice. Fragile, unstable, needs structure. The evidence list was almost surreal in its normalcy. 6 months on sertraline, prescribed by my primary care physician during my divorce, weekly therapy sessions, a single midnight phone call to Carly after my ex-husband canceled his parenting time for the 3rd consecutive week. And then there was the affidavit, signed by Carly, stating that I was prone to emotional episodes and had exhibited patterns of instability. I sat down in one of the plastic break room chairs because my knees felt unreliable. Carly doesn't use phrases like patterns of instability. Carly says, "You've had a rough month." Carly says, "That sucked, but you'll be okay." This document sounded like it had been drafted by someone who had never once seen me cry in her kitchen over burnt cookies. That night, after I tucked Noah into bed in his new room overlooking the backyard, he asked me something that made the world tilt. We were brushing his teeth. He had foam around his mouth and was concentrating very hard on not swallowing toothpaste. "Mom," he said casually, "Grandpa Tom asked if you get really sad a lot." The toothbrush paused in my hand. "He did?" I kept my voice even. Neutral. Curious. "Yeah," Noah said. "He asked if you forget things, and if there are new people at our house." New people. I could see it instantly, the narrative forming, the suggestion of chaos, of instability, of an unsafe environment. "How did that make you feel?" I asked, because therapist's reflex is hard to turn off. Noah shrugged. "I told him you forget where your keys are sometimes." I laughed. A soft, hollow sound. That was the moment something inside me went very, very still. Not angry, still. My father wasn't just filing paperwork. He was interviewing my 4-year-old. I called an attorney the next morning, Lila Hassan, recommended by a colleague who had survived her own family court nightmare. Lila's voice was low and steady, the kind that makes you lean in to hear her. We met in her office downtown. Minimal decor, clean desk, no clutter. She read the petition carefully, lips pressed together. "This isn't about safety," she said finally. "This is about leverage." Leverage. The word landed exactly where it needed to. We built our case methodically. My licensure verification from the Minnesota Board of Marriage and Family Therapy. A letter from my clinical director confirming 5 years of employment, no disciplinary actions, no complaints. Medical documentation showing a standard dosage of medication, prescribed appropriately, discontinued under supervision. Phone records demonstrating that my father had called me 32 times in 1 month, often leaving messages implying that if I couldn't handle things, he'd step in. Screenshots of texts from Denise asking pointed questions about Noah's sleep schedule and my emotional health. We documented everything. 3 weeks before the hearing, Carly called me. Her voice was thin. "I didn't write that," she said. She explained that Denise had drafted the affidavit, that my father's attorney had formatted it, that she'd been told it was just confirming I'd struggled after my divorce. She hadn't read it closely. She hadn't noticed the line implying psychiatric hospitalization. I have never been hospitalized for mental health reasons. Not once. Carly cried, said she felt sick, said she'd sign whatever correction was necessary. I hung up and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall, feeling something complicated move through me. Anger, yes, but also clarity. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was strategic. My father had lost the will contest. He couldn't take the house, so he shifted the battlefield. If he couldn't argue property, he would argue parenting. If he couldn't prove coercion, he would imply instability. The week before court, Noah's preschool called to inform me that a concerned grandparent had asked about his attendance record. They hadn't released anything, but the fact that the call had been made felt invasive in a way I can't fully describe. I started double-checking locks at night. I started screenshotting everything. I stopped answering my father's calls. Through all of it, I kept showing up to work. I sat with couples unraveling decades of resentment. I coached parents through tantrums and attachment ruptures. I spoke calmly about boundaries and emotional regulation. And every night after Noah fell asleep, I sat at Ruth's kitchen table with a growing stack of documents and reminded myself of something she once said. Strength doesn't always look loud. I didn't need to shout. I needed to prepare. Because if my father wanted to make my mental health the battlefield, he was about to learn exactly how steady I could be. 3 weeks before the hearing, the air in Minneapolis felt like it couldn't decide whether it was still winter or trying to thaw. Patches of gray snow clung to the sidewalks, and everything looked tired. That's how I felt too, like something that had endured too many cycles without fully melting. Lila and I met twice that week. She didn't waste words. She highlighted inconsistencies in my father's petition with a calm precision that made me feel steadier just sitting across from her. He has to prove risk, she reminded me. Not discomfort, not disagreement. Risk, risk. There were no CPS reports, no police calls, no medical neglect. Noah's pediatrician records were pristine. His preschool reports described him as curious, socially engaged, and kind. But family court isn't only about facts. It's about narrative. And my father had been building one for months. Lila prepared me for cross-examination. They'll lean into the medication, she said. They'll imply you're overwhelmed. They may suggest your profession gives you tools to hide instability. The irony almost made me smile. She asked me blunt questions in her office so I wouldn't be blindsided in court. Have you ever harmed yourself? No. Have you ever harmed your child? No. Have you ever been hospitalized for psychiatric reasons? Never. She nodded each time, writing in neat, decisive strokes. The corrected affidavit from Carly arrived 2 days later. This time, the language sounded like her. It acknowledged I'd struggled emotionally during my divorce, but stated clearly that I had never exhibited unsafe behavior, never been hospitalized, never been a danger to myself or Noah. It also clarified that the original document had been drafted by others. When I read it, I felt something loosen in my chest. Carly came over that Saturday with a box of pastries and eyes that wouldn't quite meet mine. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I should have read it. I wanted to be angrier than I was, but mostly I was tired, and grateful she had stepped back toward me instead of further away. Noah built a block tower between us while we talked. It toppled twice before he got the base right. I couldn't stop thinking about that. The night before court, I didn't sleep much. I lay awake listening to the radiators hiss, thinking about how Ruth used to say the house sounded alive in winter. I walked into the kitchen at 2 a.m., opened the drawer where I'd placed her handwritten letter after the funeral, and ran my fingers over the indented purple ink. Make this house gentle. I folded it back carefully and closed the drawer. The morning of the hearing, I dropped Noah at preschool at 8 a.m. He was wearing mismatched socks because he insisted they were fast socks. He hugged me quickly, already distracted by the promise of snack time. Normal morning. That was the strangest part. The world continues as if custody battles are not unfolding under fluorescent lights. When I arrived at the courthouse, my father was already seated at the petitioner's table. Denise beside him, composed as ever. Carla Jennings flipping through papers with measured calm. My father didn't look at me at first. When he did, his expression wasn't rage. It was certainty. The hearing began. Carla presented their case succinctly. She outlined my therapy history, my prescription, the midnight phone call. She referenced the original affidavit, then acknowledged the correction but suggested the pattern of distress remained concerning. Pattern of distress. It sounded like pathology. It sounded deliberate. Then my father took the stand. He spoke about routine, about structure, about concern. He described my divorce as destabilizing. He mentioned that I had leaned on family heavily. He implied that my move into Ruth's house had been impulsive. He framed help as weakness. He framed grief as dysfunction. He did not raise his voice. That almost made it worse. He sounded reasonable, measured, like a man making a thoughtful case for a child's safety. When Lila rose to cross-examine him, the temperature in the room seemed to shift. She began simply, "Mr. Merritt, are you aware that your daughter is licensed by the state of Minnesota to provide mental health services?" "Yes," he said stiffly. "Are you aware she has no disciplinary actions on record?" Silence. "I'm aware." "Are you aware she has never been hospitalized for psychiatric reasons?" A flicker. "I've heard that claim disputed." "It has not been disputed," Lila said evenly. "Medical records have been provided to the court." She moved methodically through the facts, the absence of CPS involvement, the preschool's positive reports, the call logs showing his frequency of contact, the inquiry to the preschool office. "Did you ask your 4-year-old grandson whether his mother forgets things?" she asked finally. My father hesitated. "I was checking in." "With a 4-year-old, she repeated. He shifted in his seat. It was subtle, but it was there. The narrative he'd built began to look less like concern and more like intrusion. When Lila finished, she didn't grandstand. She didn't accuse. She simply said, "There is no evidence of risk. There is evidence of retaliation following a failed estate contest." Retaliation. The word hung there. I kept my hands flat on the table the entire time. I did not interrupt. I did not defend myself aloud. I let the documentation speak. For the first time since the envelope arrived in my break room, I felt something stronger than fear. Not triumph, resolve. Because whatever happened in that courtroom, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I had not been fragile. I had been rebuilding. And that difference was about to matter. When Judge Soderberg began to speak, the room shifted into that particular kind of silence that feels almost physical. Even the scrape of chairs stopped. I could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights and the soft mechanical tapping of the court reporter's keys, slowing, then pausing. She adjusted her glasses and looked down at the stack of documents in front of her. Not rushed, not irritated, just thorough. "The petitioner," she began, "bears the burden of demonstrating that the child's current environment poses a significant risk to his well-being." Her voice was even, measured. She referenced the therapy, the medication, the corrected affidavit, the lack of any reports to Child Protective Services, the absence of medical or educational concerns, the preschool documentation describing Noah as thriving. Then she looked directly at my father. "Seeking therapy during a divorce," she said, "is not evidence of instability. It is evidence of responsibility." The words landed gently, but they landed hard. She continued, "The court also notes with concern the petitioner's inquiries directed at the minor child and at the child's educational institution." There it was, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. My father's posture stiffened. Denise's hands tightened in her lap. "The evidence presented does not establish risk," the judge said. "It suggests a dispute arising in proximity to an unsuccessful estate challenge." She didn't raise her voice when she added, "Family court is not a tool for retaliatory litigation." Retaliatory. The word echoed somewhere deep in my chest. Petition dismissed. Just like that. No dramatic gavel slam. No applause. Just the quiet administrative finality of a decision entered into record. My father opened his mouth slightly, as if preparing to respond, then closed it. Carla leaned toward him and murmured something I couldn't hear. Denise stared straight ahead. I sat still for a moment longer, waiting for the wave of emotion I expected. Relief, vindication, something cinematic. Instead, what came was breath. A long, steady exhale I hadn't realized I'd been holding for months. Lila touched my arm lightly. "It's over," she said. We gathered our folders. Papers that had consumed my kitchen table for weeks were now just documents again. Evidence entered. Case closed. In the hallway outside the courtroom, the air smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. People passed us with their own files, their own private wars. I stepped aside near a window and leaned my forehead briefly against the cool glass. Not crying, just grounding. My father walked past without speaking. For a split second, our eyes met. There was no apology there, no understanding, just something tight and wounded and proud all at once. I didn't follow him. I walked down the stairs instead of taking the elevator. Each step felt deliberate, solid. Mine. When I reached the lobby, I texted Carly, "It's done." Her response came almost immediately. "Thank God." I picked Noah up from preschool at 3 p.m. sharp, just like I'd promised. He ran toward me with a paper crown on his head and glitter on his cheeks. "Mom, I was king today." I knelt down and hugged him, breathing in the smell of tempera paint and apple slices. "Of course you were," I said. We stopped for hot chocolate on the way home. Extra whipped cream. He told me about snack time politics and how Mason wouldn't share the green crayon. Ordinary details. Perfectly ordinary. That night, after he fell asleep, I stood in Ruth's kitchen. The house felt quieter than it had in weeks. Not tense quiet, peaceful quiet. I opened the drawer where I keep her letter, lined paper. Purple ink pressed deep enough to leave ridges you can feel if you run your fingertips across the back. I've read it so many times I could recite parts of it by heart. Her handwriting slopes slightly to the right when she's emotional. The last line is underlined twice. "Make this house gentle." When I first read those words after her funeral, I thought she meant fresh paint and new curtains. Soft lighting, calm colors. Now I understand she meant something larger. Gentle isn't weak. Gentle is deliberate. Gentle is boundaries held without shouting. Gentle is choosing not to retaliate, even when you could. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the drawer. My father lost the petition. He lost the leverage. But more importantly, I didn't lose myself trying to fight him. I didn't scream in that courtroom. I didn't defend my character with fury. I let the facts speak. I let steadiness win. The most powerful thing I did through all of it was sit still and refuse to become the version of me he needed to prove his case. Upstairs, Noah turned over in his sleep, the floorboards creaking softly under my feet as I checked on him. The house exhaled around us, and for the first time in 15 months, so did I. Life will hand you moments where people misunderstand you, underestimate you, or try to rewrite your story. But steadiness is stronger than shouting. Get help when you need it, document the facts, protect your peace, and never let someone weaponize your vulnerability. And if you enjoy stories about quiet strength and smart comebacks, subscribe to the Revenge Protocol YouTube channel and drop a comment. We read them all.